Morning, everyone. Today is August 14th, and this is our weekly IPython Jupyter development meeting. We have a few the regulars missing for various reasons, but let's get going with the agenda. The first topic is where are uploaded notebooks put? I presume this is regarding the thread we had on the mailing list about by Mark Backer, right?
Yes, I think so. So he wanted to open notebooks in a desktop style and, you know, have it open them where they are, and he was trying to achieve that by uploading them into the notebook dashboard, which doesn't, and that makes a copy of the notebook where you're running the notebook server, and I don't think there's a way to make it do what he wants to do. I've tried to point him to NBOpen, which is aimed at the use case that he's trying to.
Yeah, it's a command line utility that does what he's after.
And can be wired into the GUI manager. Now, I think the only thing that I didn't check, I was going to do a quick test when he sent those emails, but I forgot, was to check when we upload. Does the uploaded notebook always land in the root directory of the server, or no? It lands in whatever page, whatever directory the dashboard is open in, right?
Yeah. So when you click upload, it adds it to that list, and then you upload it, and then it stays in that list.
Oh no, I did do that test. Actually, I did confirm that would. I mean, honestly, I don't think there's anything to change other than what.
Yeah, it's just a web app versus desktop app tension.
Yeah. And I think Thomas's answer is as good as we're gonna get.
Yeah, we could theoretically add UI. I don't know how good it can be, better than browsing with clicking, but we could add UI for like open this path. Just be able to type a whole path or something. But you can just type that path in the URL bar and it just works. So I'm not sure how much better we can do than that. But I think a lot of people have an aversion to writing in the URL bar. But I don't know. I don't. So I write full paths in the URL bar all the time.
Hey Thomas, the NBOpen that you mentioned, where is that? I'm just trying to look.
It's a repo it's under my name on GitHub. It's like
okay.
Of NBOpen.
No, yeah, that's fine. I can find it.
Well, why don't you type it in the minutes for reference?
Yeah, I'm going to put in there.
Honestly, I think we're fine as it is. I think the combination of it is a web app, and NBOpen is a good complement to that, and is good enough. I mean, over time, I could imagine, I don't know, even shipping something like NBOpen by default, so that there's a kind of desktop integration out of the box, or making that easier. But I think for now we're fine. Okay.
On the desktop integration front, I'll just say once again, it's desktop integrated with open source desktops. Pull requests are welcome to integrate it with other desktops.
Good. Yeah, and I would imagine eventually you could get integration with Windows and OS 10.
Different schemes for defining the file extension, and yeah, so OS 10 and Windows, if people want to have that integration, so you can just double-click on a notebook file and have it open and make a pull request. It's probably not very hard, but I don't know how OS 10 stuff works or Windows.
Yeah, and I think a couple of people have taken a stab at that.
No,
so
I mean, people will eventually contribute that, but I think we're fine on this.
Okay.
So, Min, did you have anything?
Nope.
Okay. So kernel Git repos are all over the place. No clear place to look for them. Should we move the ones our core devs are personally managing to the Jupyter org?
So, just an example of another, not necessarily recommending that we do this, but an example of the way another community works is in 0MQ. All the bindings and even derivative projects are on the 0MQ org. They have very little overlap with each other in terms of who is involved in them. They're basically.
Hold on, you're talking about the GitHub org, right?
Yes, sorry, it's in the GitHub org. So PyZMQ is under 0MQ. All the other like 37 language bindings are all there. Even multiple mutually exclusive bindings for the same language. There isn't like one official. There are 2 Java bindings. There are 2 .NET bindings, and they're all just under that org, mainly for discoverability. They don't like Peter doesn't participate in more than a few of them. I don't participate in more than 2 or 3. So just because they're on the Jupyter org doesn't mean they're not made by us. Not saying we should do that. I'm just saying that is something that people do. That we could just use the org for kernel discoverability. We could even make a Jupyter kernels, just a separate org that's nothing but kernel.
Yeah, though obviously the IPython one is kind of the reference one, so it would be inside of the org itself. I don't have super strong feelings one way or the other. I certainly know that the discoverability is an issue. It gives it. I mean, obviously we can. Some of that can be solved with just an index page that points to wherever those projects are. Thomas, would you rather it not? You seem to be kind of pushing in the opposite direction.
Yeah, it seems. I mean, to my mind, the point of making this an ecosystem that third parties can write things for is that we're not managing a list of kernels. I mean, we may manage an index, but it's not up to us to coordinate kernel development. People can do it wherever they want, and I don't see. I'm not quite clear why there is a problem with discoverability. I mean, there's a list that you can go and, it says if you want to, here is iHaskell, here is iRuby, here is iJulia.
Yeah.
I don't see what extra benefit we gain from putting things under a GitHub organization.
Hi, Sylvan. Welcome. Yeah, I'm also I can see a certain convenience in that you land on the org and you see everything there, but even if we're not actively involved in maintaining them, there's always everything you do has overhead. As I've learned, in my more administrative life, every last little thing you put on your plate, no matter how seemingly small, adds overhead for someone. There's always some email to do, some team to create, somebody to be given permissions to, some little thing. And so I would rather let's defer some of this in case Brian feels very strongly about it, so that he has a chance to argue further. But I'm kind of with Thomas here, also because I don't want to impose that Jupyter kernels have to be developed on GitHub. I mean, I don't know, the YT is a project that's a really big project on Bitbucket, and those guys may want to add kernels for some of the projects that YT is involved with in astrophysics. I don't know, I'm just making stuff up, and they're going to want to have them on Bitbucket, and then I think discoverability gets worse. If you have 80% of the kernels are actually org teams and repos under our org, and then this one over here is on Bitbucket, and that one over there happens to be on SourceForge, and that one over there happens to be on GNU Savannah or Code or Google Code or whatever, then actually I think it's worse, not better.
Yeah.
So
I also wanted to. Brian's mentioned in a comment that if we stopped maintaining one of the kernels that we maintain, then the rest of the Jupyter/IPython team would probably pick it up. I
don't think that's true at all.
I mean, given that I'm the only one who's ever used R, I don't see why the rest of the team would take that on.
Yeah, I don't see John champing at the bit to maintain the R kernel if you all of a sudden stop maintaining it. So, yeah, I wish that were true. I think Brian is expressing a good goal to aspire to, but I don't think we live up to those standards, I'm afraid. Yeah. Where should we document this stuff? Yeah, I think the Jupyter docs. I think we just need to start building Jupyter docs. For now, unfortunately, we're still in the awkward. Yeah, the IPython docs are the wrong place. It's a little
the new
awkward.
place doesn't exist yet. So.
the new place doesn't exist yet, so we're going to have to live with this awkwardness for a little longer.
Yeah. So just another point which seems to have come up. Min just searched for like index Python kernels, and
it's like the index of IPython kernels is like the 10th result for index of IPython kernels.
Yeah. So possibly it's currently a subheading under projects using IPython. I think we should promote that to its own wiki page and give it a very clear title.
Absolutely, absolutely. And maybe one thing we should do in the meantime to help discoverability, why don't we link to it from the main IPython homepage? The main IPython homepage is ranked very high. I'm playing a little bit of SEO here, but the main IPython page is ranked very highly. So let's link to it from the homepage.
Yeah.
So let's promote it.
Yeah. Improving the page rank and discoverability of the index, I think, is fairly easy.
We'll go a long way in helping with this problem.
Yeah. Yep. All right.
Okay. So action items. We need to take some notes. I'd like to ask that whoever is not speaking help typing, basically, so that we end up with good notes on everything. So whoever is okay. Kernel installs kernel specs in inconsistent ways. Some do it automatically upon installing the package. Other require separate step. Many don't install the kernel spec yet.
Yeah, logically enough, because we haven't released the kernel spec stuff yet.
I think the answer here is we will. I mean, this is kind of picking up.
Yeah, this is what we were talking about yesterday.
What's that?
This is what we were talking about yesterday. Is how do kernels install kernel specs into what do we present to kernel authors as the installation process for kernels, and then how do kernel authors present kind of the secondary version of that to their users for how to install.
Should we Min, do you want to run a quick summary of our conversation from yesterday so that everybody is in the loop? And by quick, I don't mean we spent like 2 hours. So and I'll take some notes in the. You want to
quick summary? Installing stuff is hard.
Yeah, installing stuff is hard.
Yeah, but getting the others who are on the call in the loop, in case anybody has any feedback as well.
Yeah, so installing a kernel is basically copying a directory.
I'll take notes.
With the kernel spec. So kernel spec is a directory with at least one file in it. Most kernel specs that currently exist are only one file. Installing the kernel spec means copying a directory to another location, which can be either in the IPython directory for a user install, or it could be in user local share IPython for a system-wide install. There's a Windows program data stuff that's analogous to user local.
Environments.
Yeah, environments might have share under a prefix, like environment root / share IPython. And then things like system package manager managed kernels would go in /user or something. So there's a bit of a question of what API do we provide and what default behavior do we have in that API for installing the kernel. Like, is the default user local? Is the default sys.prefix, which would mean in the environment, or is the default a user install in the IPython directory? And then, depending on what the default is, what API do we have to kind of do the other things? And remembering that the more complex and specific the API gets, the smaller the advantage becomes over just doing cp-r, since that's ultimately what it ends up doing.
yeah, the reason that we have an install kernel command is that it should do some measure of automatic picking of where is the right place to install the kernel, so that you don't have to kernel authors don't have to rewrite that logic on top of CP.
Yeah. So, I don't know. The gist of I think where we ended up was that the user local kind of system-wide install makes the most sense as the default behavior, and then adding support for prefix installs and like a dash dash prefix and a dash dash user kind of thing should be about is kind of where we landed on that.
Yeah,
but we're not super confident.
I went home and started thinking about maybe environment variables rather than command line flags the way to do this, because then packages can set environment variables externally.
Yeah, environment variables. Yeah, I think there's room for our config stuff to better deal with environment variables too. Yeah, I think that's a quick summary before I get too much into it.
And I took some notes from the best that I could remember from yesterday, and I put them down there. So at least the start of our policy, sort of, and you guys can feel free to correct them if I made any mistakes or if I left any key point out, because we don't want to spend the whole meeting on this. Does anybody have any question about this, either what Min said or what I wrote down in the notes? And if not, we can. I mean, this is an important problem, and we're making progress on it. It's just not going to happen overnight.
Yep. All right. I think we can move on. I imagine Brian has lots of thoughts, but he's in Boston, I guess. Almost ecstatic.
Okay, so the next one is fixed, so that's not a problem anymore. Installing Python 2. Okay, this is taken care of under the above. Thank you. Whoever's typing, Jonathan, thank you. Go ahead, please. The architecture is fantastic because we can't ship this. Yep, it's improving.
Yeah, no, ecstatic is the next thing on that.
So I came across this the other day. It's an API for packaging static data into Python packages that you can have a xstatic jQuery package, and then there is a Python API that lets you look up where that actually is on disk, so that you can wire it up to web handlers or load data files manually or whatever. I don't know a lot about it. I think it's pretty new, so maybe it's not the right approach. But given how much static resources we have, it seemed like an interesting thing to be aware of.
I hadn't heard of it. It sounds very cool. I would definitely keep this on the radar to look further at it, and it may be that we want to start using it. Do we know? One question: Do we know of anyone who's actually using it?
No, I think this is new, as in like under a month old. I think I may be completely wrong about that, but
yeah, the page.
It lists stuff from 2010 for prior work from 2010.
And the page has says copyright 2011.
Okay,
Let's have a look at the repo commits. Is there a way to go to the end, the first commit of? Oh, the first commit is 2011. Okay. So it has a fairly single developer, short commit history, but maybe it's a simple tool, and maybe a simple tool doesn't need 100,000 lines of code.
Yeah, I mean a thin wrapper around. You could do a Python distutils wrapper around Bower or something that kind of fakes. Or implements the Bower protocol. I don't know exactly how it works, but
Lynn's also done a search, and there do seem to be quite a few, xstatic packages for different things already on GitHub.
Okay, fair enough.
Xstatic D3 there, for example.
Yeah.
Definitely worth looking into. Absolutely. Thank you.
The only potential downside I could see was that JavaScript things often, rely on fairly specific versions, and versions change pretty quickly. So it's going to get messy if you have one thing on your project, on your system, that depends on jQuery whatever version, and one thing that depends on another version.
Yep.
Oh.
Yeah. So it may be a bit tricky, but it's definitely worth looking into. If we can express dependencies other than having our little Bower file, I mean, yeah, if we could express dependencies, it would be nice.
Okay. Well, let's see what it's good for and what it can be useful for. Embedding videos.
So someone opened a pull request to add support for a video display class, like we already have image and audio, which makes sense. My only concern with it was that it allows you to actually embed base64 encoded video data, which I imagine is going to get impractical if your video is more than about 5 seconds long. And I mean, obviously there's the argument that it's up to the author what they do with the tool, and we're just providing the tool. But I think if we provide a tool that can embed the data, we're implicitly promising that that's a practical thing to do. And I haven't tried it, but I would not be at all surprised if that is a horribly impractical thing to do.
I think we actually, in our IPython examples, we have one embedded in MPEG-4.
Yeah.
Like it's a total 2-second toy. So it really is. I mean, it's a tiny animation of a wave propagation or something. I don't know.
It's animation.
Since I think it kind of makes sense to have classes for the.
It's in displaysystem.ipynd.
Yeah. I think
that Christie's created.
Okay. I think having a video class makes sense. The embedding, it's one strong difference between image and video is that embedding should never happen unless it's explicitly requested. If we do allow it, I think it makes sense to allow it just to have, a list of the HTML5 elements. Just kind of makes sense to me. But the normal way to have a video element is with a URL. So I think supporting embedding and making sure that it doesn't happen except by explicit requests seems reasonable. Right, because if there's an example that says turning embed equals false, because embedding is the default behavior, which is what we do for images, and I think doing embed equals
you should need
to say embed equals true in order for it to embed.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
So that you if you try to do something that it would embed implicitly, you get an error saying, you must embed explicitly because it's probably a bad thing to do. I think seems reasonable because it's perfectly reasonable to say, video URL equals my video, and that's easier to type than display HTML video tag.
Yeah. Which is what we're doing to do all the base64 encoding yourself. But if we don't embed
but you don't base64 encode anything in most cases. Base64 is only for embedding, but the class is still useful when you're not embedding anything.
But my question is, when you don't embed, who does the serving of the data?
Wherever the file is. If it's a local file, it's served by the files handler, by the notebook server, because the notebook server already serves all files in the tree. So if you just have URL equals filename.mp4, that works. Or src equals filename.mp4, that works.
Okay.
Because relative URLs work.
So can you remember, Min, when we did this example with Chris Keys, which is really old? Why did we do it with src equals data : video by doing an explicit embedding, and why didn't we do it? Did we not have a files handler at the time so that we could?
I don't know. It was one of the. We added the files handler quite early, but that was one of the first examples we did. So it might have been before the files handler.
I'm starting to suspect that because I think otherwise we would have.
But also, I think a lot of people just don't know that the files handler is a thing. So.
Yeah. So what about audio? I wouldn't want to do. What's the status with audio right now? I think audio, in that regard, I think audio and video should be handled similarly. I mean, audio can be smaller, but it still gets pretty big.
Yeah, I think we should revisit whether embedding. I don't know what happens when we do. The audio API is mostly on passing binary data, and if you pass binary data, you have to embed it because it doesn't exist in a file. But yeah, we should try to make them similar, I think.
Don't you think that? Yeah, don't you think that audio and video should be handled?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. So basically, the answer would be by default we embed static content like images. And by default, we don't embed kind of dynamic content like audio and video.
Yeah, big stuff. Yeah.
Well, but the thing is big. You can have a PNG that's bigger than that little video file. I mean, the thing is big.
Yeah, no.
The threshold can't be big.
Potentially big.
Well, we could actually have an "Are you sure?" if you try to embed something larger than a meg, because we know exactly how many bytes it is. So that's another thing we could do. Say, if this is really big, it's probably a bad idea to embed it. But that adding a kind of heuristic like that's probably not the best.
Yeah, and heuristics that require human intervention are terrible.
Yeah, and 99% of PNGs are small. The vast majority of images are small. The vast majority of audio and video files are big. So relative to, once you base64 encode it and shove it in JSON, if it's more than a couple megs, which almost all audio files are, I don't know, having audio chirps and things makes more sense than video blips.
The demonstration, the tutorial with machine learning on birdsong at SciPy made quite good use of the audio thing to display a few seconds of birdsong.
Yeah, and at low sample rates, I think there are more audio examples that are small enough to embed than video, because you're probably not embedding a just a big MP3 or something. In fact, it doesn't work because it needs to be. Yeah, we can look into exactly how similar audio and video, because it might make sense for audio to be a bit more liberal about embedding than video.
It might.
But I think embedding by implicit embedding of video is just not something we should do.
Yes, I think we all. Does anyone disagree on that? Even though yes, it is a special case and special cases are bad, but still, I do think that this is making the system in most cases do the wrong thing is a bad sacrifice to uniformity.
Yeah.
Does anyone disagree? Okay, so I think we're all on the same page, and we'll look into whether audio should be treated more like video or more like images. But otherwise, okay. All right, architecture for file manager, text editor, terminal trio in the notebook. Okay, Thomas.
So it occurred to me that we've said for some time that we think that we need to add to the UI a basic text editor and a terminal so that it's usable without having to SSH in. And it kind of hit me that there are certainly people who will want to run the notebook without the the file manager text editor terminal trio if you're running on a local system and you have better versions of all of those. So yeah, backtracking a little, the dashboard is also under pressure to become a file manager, and Brian wants to kind of balance it so we add some bits but don't go full-blown file manager. And I didn't think there's any neat circumscription of the scope of what we're aiming for there. I think there's always going to be pressure to add more file manager features, and we don't want to do that within IPython. Text editor is similarly, scope can expand almost infinitely. Terminals are pretty well constrained though. So yeah, there are people who will want to run only the notebook part. I can imagine a lot of people would very much like to have a file manager text editor terminal trio that they can install on their server without necessarily having the notebook part. And also, if we, if this was spun out as a separate project, then those parts would be free to grow features to a much greater extent than they are if they're just kind of add-ons to the IPython notebook, and it's just a little kind of, we're not really giving you a file manager, but we're giving you a bit of a file manager. So I suggested that should be at some point. I mean, obviously not immediately, because so far we don't actually have the text editor or the terminal part, so it looks like they're not that far off now. But at some point we should spin this out as a separate project and have a kind of like, basic utility apps project which would ship these, and then the notebook would be able to in some way talk to them, so that when you clicked on a notebook in the file manager, it would open up the notebook web interface. The flip side of that, as Brian pointed out, is that then we're going from a rapidly expanding scope in terms of the applications to a rapidly expanding scope in terms of a framework for building applications. Although my inclination is that the framework for building applications is a clearer scope, or could be a clearer scope than actually including those applications themselves.
Yeah.
And yeah, it would have to be a kind of multiple stage process, I guess, in which we gradually kind of teased these apart and worked out what the interfaces were by which the notebook could talk to the other applications. And
yeah, but I would say I am concerned about it basically becoming a completely generic web framework, which I think is what what you're talking about and what Brian was worried about. And I think if we try to sort of modularize too far in that direction, then we end up with the responsibility of effectively maintaining stable APIs for a web-based desktop environment set of components. And I actually, yes, we are kind of there, but I think it's also okay if we say, well, we're kind of there, but up to a point, and if you don't like what we have, then do something else. I mean, Midnight Commander is a perfect example of a text-based little sort of, you can think of it as a mini desktop environment in a terminal, and it has a little file manager and has a little text editor built into it, and they don't make it possible to change everything. They're like, well, this is what we provide, and these are the basic things you can do with our environment, and if you don't like this, I mean, just go use something else. We're not going to make it pluggable.
And lots of people do use other things. I don't think I've ever seen anyone using Midnight Commander.
Yeah,
and that's fine, and that's totally fine. I mean, I think our answer has to be at some point, we do certain things well, and if what the problem we're solving doesn't solve your problems, you're welcome to use a different tool, and that's totally okay.
But at the same time, if the text editor that we're offering doesn't solve your problems, you shouldn't have to ditch the notebook in order to use a better text editor.
Yeah, the text editor is a tricky one, and I could see eventually making the text editor pluggable, but eventually with lots of ease in that eventually. I think we should look. People are living with the current notebook that has horrible editing limitations. I mean, you can't copy and paste more than 2 cells at a time, other than with Paul's extension, which is unfinished. You can't copy and paste across notebooks with any tool.
Yes,
you can't
but
do
there's no real alternative to the notebook. I mean, there are plenty of alternatives. There's nothing really equivalent to the notebook that people can switch to.
No, but I mean, people can still SSH into that machine. People can still SSH into that machine and use any of the many Unix text editors that exist.
But the design of the multi-user server is such that people shouldn't have to SSH into the machine.
Yeah. So one
but
question.
they will have a terminal. So
they will have a terminal, yes.
Yeah. So
the terminal does give you access to all the text, all of the text-based editors at least, which includes PI, Emacs, JED, Joe.
PI and Emacs users will be happy.
So kind of the traditional Unix tool chains will be there. No, and it's true. It'll be limited for a while, and we'll try to provide we'll use a decent text editor. And honestly, I suspect that'll cover a lot of use cases because the people who tend to be most persnickety about their tool chains are often die-hard Emacs VI users who really like a very well customized command line environment, and that they can get the editor.
Sure, but there's no neat circumscription of what features are in a decent text editor. It's easy to say a decent text editor, but there's no neat boundary we can draw where these features are in scope for a decent text editor and these are out of scope. You know.
Yes, the fact that all known text editors are their auto indent is entirely defeated by Python's semantic whitespace. And that seems feature number.
No, I know that. If the definition of decent text editor was an easy one, we would have stopped having new text editors, and people are still writing text editors. So I do know that if there's one tool that will never be, quote, finished, it's the text editor, right? Which means that by definition, whatever we have, the one we have will never satisfy everyone, right? But I would say we put a serviceable one and we see what happens. And if after having had it in use for a while, it looks like it's easy to make it pluggable, we make it pluggable. And if it's not easy to make it pluggable, sorry.
Yeah, and I think.
But I think we need to weigh the downside of making a generic web framework against the downside of making a file manager and a text editor, which are both. I think the scope of a web framework is much easier.
All the sides are down. Is the gist of it.
But I think this, if I'm not saying we have to make a web framework now, but going down the road, I think it's much easier to define the scope of a framework for making web apps than it is to define the scope of a file manager and text editor.
Yeah, and to some degree, we took some steps in that direction for IPython 2 in taking each of the components of kernel specs, kernels, notebooks, which became contents, and made each of those self-contained
Go ahead.
Self-contained bits of code that followed some pattern, so that in the notebook app you say, load handlers from services contents, load handlers from services kernels, load handlers from the tree app, load handlers from, etc. And so it is already organized to some degree in terms of independent components that have some kind of API. And so as long as we keep building in kind of with that model in mind, it wouldn't be that great of a step to say, okay, those are actually components that you can add, and maybe the list of components that you load is a configurable thing. Or even if it's not configurable, you do it in a subclass. The way Brian tends to talk about it is the way you don't, it's not a configurable like command line argument you can specify, but you do it in your subclass of the notebook app that behaves differently, which is what we did for collaboratory, or what we did in the, or sort of what I did in the single cell server, which is what Paul was talking about. It's but as long as we keep things fairly modular, whether they're, however we expose that modularity, it'll make it easier to just to kind of make a decision later on in terms of whether we want to.
We are going to have to face this in practice. I'm fully aware of that. I also think that we can survive. I would want to see us in usage with just a terminal widget and a text editor for at least 6 months to a year in concrete use, resisting the moans and whines of the peanut gallery about how they don't have their favorite text editor feature and they can live with it, and then we can think a little bit with actual experience. We can see exactly how we draw those boundaries. I know we are going to have to do some of that. I'm fully aware.
We're already getting some of these whines about the file manager features in the dashboard, and already we don't have a clear answer. It's sort of like, we push back on each one saying, we don't want script this to go into a full-featured file manager, but then we say, it would be nice just to be able to do this little thing and that little thing, and
and that's okay.
One thing that we've talked about in the past that I don't think we've brought up today is things like we've talked about the terminal thing being something that is a feature of the multi-user server and not a feature of the single-user server. I don't know if we want to discuss that kind of thing right now. If we still think that's a good idea.
How close are you? How close are you with the code? To of the multi-user one to start testing this, man?
Start testing what? Testing I don't have a terminal anything. If I stop working on other things, I keep finding other things to work on, but I can switch. And I think NB format is the NB format 4 stuff is probably more important than the multi-user stuff, at least to get done early.
Yeah.
But adding a terminal thing to the multi-user doesn't add much complexity to that, other than figuring out what terminal thing to use and how to embed it and all that stuff.
Yeah, but the question is whether we want to open the terminal as something that is opened only by the multi-user guy, or that's something that is open in the single-user guy, right?
Yeah, that's a question that we should answer. And one thing we could do is we could build the multi-user server in this kind of more modular way, in multiple pieces, and see how that goes.
But for example, I think the terminal has to be opened by the single user one.
Right, it has to be opened as the user, but it doesn't have to be opened by the single user notebook web app.
It could run.
Yeah, well, but here's one reason why, at least initially, I would put it there for simplicity, which is, imagine that you're spawning your single user notebook servers inside of Docker containers. It's going to be hard if now you have to open the terminal. So obviously you want the terminal to be open next to where those files are, right? And where those.
But you start that at the same time, in the same way, right? So that starting the terminal server and starting the notebook server, that would be one step. It might be two processes. So I don't think there's any extra complexity for starting those both in the same Docker container. There might be some. I could be wrong, but
Yeah, there's a part of me, and the other thing that I've been wondering is what do we think? And honestly, I don't have an answer. I'm thinking out loud here. What do we think? Do we want the experience to be with the terminals? Can you open more than one, or can you open only one? Does it open in the directory that the dashboard is currently open on? Is it open from sort of where do you open that? And because we want to give that terminal an initial working directory.
Mm-hmm.
And
when you
and
interface to
so
something, that working directory is home.
always the start.
Yeah.
Always the start of the basically the start of the user.
A login shell starts in home, and then depending on different terminal emulators, when you open, say, a new tab, conventions vary. They vary. Yeah. Having a open terminal here link in the dashboard that does open a terminal with a particular path. I don't think that's very complicated. But it's just a question of we talked about, this is how it's been discussed before, is that we have talked about the terminal as a feature of the multi-user server.
Mm-hmm.
In part because I find it hard to imagine use cases for the terminal in the single user case. Because in the single user case, the odds of not having access to a regular terminal, which will always be better, are very low. And it lets us, since the multi-user server is a more experimental thing on account of the fact it doesn't exist, then it's an easier place to play around with. There are obviously advantages to having it integrated into the single user server as well, but I just wanted to bring up that we had talked about that difference.
For me, at least, even though I know that I can log into a server, if I've got a notebook server up and running and I'm working there maybe with multiple people, I'd rather not have to go SSH and mingle keys or figure out how I'm going to get to it. I'm just going to want to open it right there.
Okay.
Especially in some data workflow. I don't really care about. Yeah, I mean, I just want to mess with the files or do whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if I want to tell you about an awkward workflow, I had a really fun, and that's in quotes, time working with IPython Notebook inside a container and then wondering how to get data in and out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did Docker volumes not help?
I was working within the notebook itself. So it was like, how do I put data into the notebook from the beginning? Like, how do I put the notebooks that I've already built in there? And then if I want to move that to a new machine, how do I work with it? Yeah.
No, that's exactly the workflow that we want to try to make it easier. But the question, Kyle, is imagine you had a multi-user server ready to go. Would that be enough to give you the terminal access that you want, or are you thinking that if the entry point to the terminal was from the multi-user server, do you think that would be enough, or do you think that you would really want it to be kind of attached to the single user one because you're spinning single user ones by yourself in Docker containers yourself without using the the not yet existent multi-user server, and so that therefore you'd rather have the terminal live inside of the single user one so that you know that it's always there no matter how you start the single user one. Even if you did it with your custom Docker starter, you always want to have that terminal in there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm saying I would definitely want it in the single user one. Just because, though right now we've got it that it's all on one system, I want to make sure that the single user, so when I'm using the terminal within some single user notebook, that it's in the same context as the notebook. It's the notebook server itself.
Yeah, that was kind of my inclination when I was saying at the beginning that I was kind of leaning in that direction. That I think that I would put it in there, kind of precisely for those reasons. But that's what Min was arguing, that we could start it in there, a separate process when we started, but that you would put it in the multi-user one for simplicity of development right now. And there is an argument to that as well.
I mean, the reason that we want a terminal is about local versus remote rather than single versus multi-user, and it's perfectly valid to have a single user notebook server running on a remote server that you may not want to bother SSHing into separately. So from that point of view, I think it makes sense to push to the single user one.
So
yeah, it's kind of making those use cases easier. That is the argument in favor of putting it in the single user one.
Yeah, well, I'm saying that the remote versus local is really an orthogonal question from single versus multi-user, even though most of the time the single user one is run locally and the multi-user one we expect will be run remotely.
Yeah, and it depending on how it works, you could, if we do add things to the multi-user notebook that make it more useful in remote contexts, starting a multi-user notebook with a user whitelist of length 1 in order to get something wouldn't be that big. I did want to make one point. One of the reasons we were talking about the terminal in the multi-user server is the multi-user server will have a Node.js dependency, and until very recently, we only knew of terminal emulators with Node.js on the back end, but now there's the PyX term, which is a Tornado backend for term.js, which means it will be a lot easier. It is actually feasible for us to have a terminal emulator that integrates well into the single user notebook, but that wasn't true until a couple months ago, I think. So that was another reason to put it in the multi-user server, is that it can express dependencies. It can express the kind of sysadmin, easy for a sysadmin, hard for a Python package dependencies that are more appropriate for the multi-user server than the single user server.
And have you looked? I didn't know about this PyX term. Have you looked at it? Have you tested it?
I haven't tested it. I was just looking. But there was
posted to the mailing list.
Yeah, Thomas posted it to the mailing list last month.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You even said plus lots! Exclamation point! Exclamation.
Oh, okay. Now it came back. Yes.
Yes.
But I didn't go test it. I didn't go actually try to play with it.
So assuming it works, I don't think it's that complicated, right? It's basically so term.js has a server side and client side components, and they basically just re-implemented the server side as a Tornado app. Yeah. So I think assuming they did a reasonable job.
And the guy, did you see at SciPy, Fernando, the talk on graph term, which was another take on a kind of web-based interactive coding environment aimed at learning?
No, I didn't see it.
Yeah, it was quite an interesting talk. The guy behind it is the guy who does that.
Yeah.
So he seems to be fairly competent.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
And
good,
he's
good. No,
interested in IPython, so he said that he's willing to give us a hand with integrating that.
Yeah. So that's I had forgotten about. That was one of the reasons we were thinking about the multi-user server, which appears to no longer be an issue.
Yeah, but that lowers the barrier.
Yep.
That lowers the barrier for putting it in the single user one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, crosses an important threshold as we can install it. Yeah, which is kind of a big deal. Or not we can install it. Our users can install it. Which is a different statement.
But in some ways, even bigger.
Yes, not much bigger. Okay.
And
okay,
finally,
well, I think we do need to start honing on these decisions, though, because I think we want to start making sort of a realistic 2 to 3 month plan for getting 3.0 out. And this is a decision that I think we probably want to revisit this one again next week until we converge on something that we want to implement. And maybe between now and then we can have a quick look at that PyX term thing and see exactly if that tells us anything.
Yep.
Okay, and finally, Mime type for notebooks.
Okay, so I have for NBOpen, I needed a Mime type for notebooks, and I picked text/x IPyND. For Brian Hamlin from OSGO contacted me recently about something, and I noticed in a code snippet that they were using application/x-IPython notebook as the Mime type. It doesn't particularly matter as far as I'm aware what is used, but it would be nice to have inconsistent story. Has anyone else had to define a Mime type for notebooks? If so, what have you picked? What do you think should be picked?
Yeah, I don't know. So, first of all, this goes to the question actually of are we going to change the extension as we move to really kernel agnostics, and are we going to call this? Are we going to remove the PY from that extension?
I don't know why we would.
And do we want to put IPython? What's that?
JPYNB is fine. It's just admitting that engineers won the debate between I and J for complex numbers.
JPYNB.
Somebody also, was it Min, who pointed out that in Latin...
Yeah, in Latin there is only I. There is not I and J. So
J.
in fact, IPy and IPY
Jupyter comes from Latin.
Yeah, so
It's already
Latin. Yeah, technically
IPython.
the right way to do Jupyter is IUPY for some reason. So it's already correct. So we don't need to.
Already correct.
Yeah.
It was correct 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. Except for the Y, but
Historical precedent is on our side.
yeah. And the cost of changing is so high, I think,
That we would have been stuck with it.
that the benefits of changing, I think, are close to zero. I don't know.
Maybe you're right. I don't know. I'm one of those people. That's my OCD showing, though. My OCD is a little flares up on things like this, and so it does bother me a little bit. But maybe I should just crank up the meds.
Remind your OCD about the not breaking user space thing that we're always promising we will do.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, you're probably right. I should just quiet it down a little bit. Okay, so if we do that, I certainly think we shouldn't call it. So first of all, which are the ones in use of the three that are in the hackpad? I don't think that's
the
not
top one is not in use, but the lower two are, I think.
The middle one. Oh, there they go.
Someone deleted them.
And are they spelled like that? I want to know exactly.
No, the OSGO distro is calling it application/x- and then like IPython notebook written out. I think it was all one word. Let me check that.
Okay. Like that. Okay.
Yeah, x-IPython notebook.
Who was this?
This was Brian Hamlin of OSGO. We see him at like D-Lab and things. He has long hair, usually in a ponytail.
And the second one is from you, from NBOpen?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so what are the criteria in MIME type definition between application and text? Because yes, JSON is text, but text that has so much base64 data frequently encoded.
Well, and specifically, JSON itself is not text. JSON itself is application JSON.
Okay, I didn't know that
Okay.
one. In that case, application is
JSON-P with callbacks.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Kyle, I couldn't hear you. Can you repeat?
Oh, I was saying that JSON is application JSON, and then it's only text JSON if it's like JSON-P.
that makes no sense, but whatever.
That's at least in the RFC. I think application makes more sense.
Okay.
That's RFC 4627. I'll link that there.
Okay, and can somebody tell me what are the criteria when defining MIME types between what goes on the left and what goes on the right of the slash? Do they have guidance on that? Is that the RFC for...
The left-hand part is one of a small number of set names, like text, application, image, audio. There is a defined and very short list of things that can go on the left side. I think those are called media types, and then the subtype, which is the part after the slash, can be essentially anything. So I think if you, I don't know quite who approves MIME types, but if you make up your own, you're supposed to start it with X dash, and then official ones can use that.
And yeah, do they go to the W3C or who or the IETF?
I don't know.
Okay.
Wikipedia.
So it sounds like it should be application / X / something. If we go by those guidelines, right?
Yes. Yeah, I think if you make it up, it should start with X hyphen.
So it should be application / X dash, and things should have dashes, it sounds like. And so I think, yeah, JSON IPyNB. Okay, no, oops, this is good. JSON IPyNB, pluses or dashes? How does it go?
So
okay,
the two that I wrote are based on the fact that SVG is image / SVG plus XML.
So it's kind of the format plus saying how the format is encoded kind of thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, there are a few things. I'm just looking. So IANA, the Internet Assigned, I can't remember what IANA stands for, Internet Assigned Numbers Authority, manages the registry of MIME types. And there are quite a lot of things that end in plus XML or plus JSON or plus zip.
Yeah, so it seems like, yeah, plus JSON is a common
And those
suffix.
plus JSON do mostly seem to be under application, not under text.
Honestly, in my mind, there's only two realistic ones. IPyNB or IPyNB plus JSON, or either IPyNB or Jupyter Notebook fully spelled out. I think those are the two realistic ones moving forward. Either the full name of the project or the file extension, and whether to do the plus JSON or not on either of them. Does it seem like everybody does the plus whatever? Is that sort of the standard practice?
Not everybody, but enough people, I think.
Okay. I don't feel strongly one way or another. I mean, I don't know if it's useful. I tend to prefer things that the shorter the better, but maybe it is useful.
It's a MIME type. It's not something you're going to type.
Yeah, really. The number of times I have typed out MIME types, I can probably count on my fingers. I would be inclined to put the plus JSON in.
You would be inclined to what? I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh right, sorry, typing. I would be inclined to put the plus JSON in.
The plus JSON, yeah, that's fine with me. X is for, and Kyle, does it say who removes the X?
No, but all the ones that like there's a font that's up there right now. I think it's until it becomes a standard by
IETF or W3C or who?
Candidate recommendation. Let's see.
And there still isn't an official MIME type for Python.
IANA, the Internet Assigned Name Numbers Authority.
Okay, so we're going to be X for a while. That's fine.
Yeah. Given that there still isn't, the X prefix is still on Python code. So
fair enough.
I think
okay.
I would say the X prefix will be on us for the first order forever.
Yeah. So it's going to be X dash something plus JSON. It seems like we're agreeing on that. And I guess that gives us, if in 5 or 10 years, for whatever reason, we stop using JSON and we decide to use something else, it helps that we could say, well, this is the same kind of data but encoded, not JSON encoded, but encoded in whatever happens later. So I'm okay with that.
There is a form on IANA.org where you can you can request
Why?
registrations for official Mime types. So that is how the X would disappear. But yeah, I think it's making the X disappear is low priority, I would say.
Yeah. I don't know. How do people feel about the two options? It seems like basically we're down to either IPyNB or Jupyter Notebook. I think that okay, Kyle is voting for IPyNB. For shortness. So the two options are basically these.
Everybody put your little face icon on which one you're voting for.
Okay. Okay. I'm losing on this one. That's fine. Wow. I'm really... Hey,
I thought you
guy.
said you liked short. I thought you said you liked short as possible.
Yeah, I do like short, but I'm sort of thinking of sort of the future branding of the project and sort of, but at the same time, short is fine. It is true that Jupyter-Notebook is kind of a mouthful, and that way it's immediately clear that those are those files. So I'm happy to submit to peer pressure and be mobbed by this unruly gang.
Now,
Okay, well,
here's a nice example of a good MIME type. So that we have this one. In the hip chat.
In hip chat?
Yeah, the vendor prefixes. Things that
Great.
start with VND can get pretty long.
Oh my god, that is just so wrong. Yeah, no.
So you can do domain style namespacing if you want. So in addition to hyphens.
So we can
use dots if we wanted.
Jupyter.org.notebook.whatever.
It would be org.jupyter.notebook. Gotta get it in the right order.
Does anyone actually have the org and com? I think it's VND dot. I don't think it's actual.
I think you have to. It's not domain. It's domain style, but it's not actual domain.
Yeah, it would be something like vnd.jupyter.notebook.
Yeah.
What does VND stand for?
Vendor.
Vendor. Vendor.jupyter-notebook. Yeah, screw that.
But I think those vendor ones still need to be registered.
Yes, these are all registered vendor ones.
Okay.
So we have to be x-vnd.jupyter. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's leave this one unless and see if next week anybody has any strong opinions. Otherwise, we'll settle on this one. I'm okay. I'm okay being mobbed.
Okay, I'm going to let Brian know that that's the most likely decision quickly though, because they're releasing a version of their GIS distro in the next few days if they haven't already.
Do me a favor and ping a message on the mailing list with this decision as a hey, last call for any input on this. In case anybody thinks otherwise, please jump in. And man, I saw you're gonna chat with Brian this afternoon.
Yeah, I'm chatting with Brian and Quantopian about multi-user.
Why don't you bring this up quickly? Just take 2 minutes to bring this up with Brian in case he has any thoughts on it, and that way we give everybody a chance to kind of speak quickly, and otherwise we just let the decision stand. Alrighty. Anything else? Otherwise, I can make my way to campus.
Nope.
Yes, we finished. All right, I'm leaving. See you guys soon. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye,
everyone.
Internet.
Bye, Internet. Thanks, everybody.
See you, Damian.